Mark chapter 8, beginning in verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." So, of course, the disciples go on to have misunderstood what Jesus meant to imply by this issue of the yeast. And so they start talking about whether they have enough bread, and that leads him back into reminding them about the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And that's really when I preached through this passage what I dealt with. But what I want to talk about tonight is this issue that it looms in the life of Jesus. And perhaps we've asked and answered it a few times, but I just want to pause and think about it again. What were the Pharisees looking for? What would have persuaded them that Jesus was who he claimed to be? And Jesus did so many miracles. He healed so many people. He drove out demons. And yet the Pharisees, looking at him, they just could not believe that he was who he claimed to be. And so the question we ask tonight is, why is that? What was it? What could Jesus have done? Now, I talked about this a little bit in the sermon on the week we dealt with this passage, that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they're not specifically looking for a healing or some sort of dramatic miracle like the feeding of the 5,000. They're calling Jesus back to the Torah, back to the law of Moses. And what they're interested in finding out is whether or not Jesus will give them a prophecy, a prediction of something that's going to happen that will come true. And that's legitimate for them to ask for, because the law says that many prophets will come, but there will be a test to know whether or not a prophet is from God. And the test will be that they will predict something that has not yet happened, and it will come true. 10 out of 10 times, 100% of the time, the predictions have to be true, or else the community will know that the person is not from God. Now, this is interesting because of all the miracles that Jesus does, of all the things that he demonstrates and all the power he demonstrates, this is one thing he doesn't do, at least not transparently, not concretely. He does not give them a prophecy of something that's going to come that then gets fulfilled in their presence so that they could know for certain. Now, of course, there are hints of prophecies which when the apostles look back on the life of Jesus, they sort of in hindsight say, oh, he did predict some things. But at the time, they never recognized that's what he's doing. For instance, when he walks among the temple and the disciples are just awed at the masonry and the beauty, and they say, look, Lord, look at how beautiful this temple is. And he says, I tell you the truth, not one stone will be left on top of another. Right? That is a prophecy. Of course, it's one that wouldn't be fulfilled for quite a long time. I mean, the Romans, this is probably in 33 AD, thereabouts. And the Romans would conquer the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD, so we're talking 40 years later almost. And then they wouldn't actually see the prophecy fulfilled where no stone is on top of another until the Romans came back and wiped out the capital city of Israel in 135. So that's way out. So that's useless to the Pharisees in Jesus' day, right? I mean, that kind of a prophecy doesn't do anything for them. But he gave another prophecy, and he said that this temple will be destroyed, another context, seemingly talking about his body, and in 3 days God will raise it. That's the one prophecy he gives. And so his resurrection becomes that one prophecy, his one final sign. And the apostles make a huge deal of that in Matthew and in Luke, but not in Mark. In Mark, it doesn't say that. In Mark, we don't hear those wonderful words, I won't give you any sign but the sign of Jonah. That's the part that gets to the resurrection, right? In Mark, he says no such thing. He just simply refuses. And this gets at a question that perplexes, scholars who read Mark. And if you were to read commentaries on Mark, this is a section where people kind of hem and haw. They think that Matthew corrected Mark, because Matthew reminds us that Jesus did answer them. He said, I'll give you the sign of Jonah. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. Right? That's the prophecy. That's the sign. But why not here in Mark? What is Mark trying to help us to see by specifically showing Jesus as refusing to give them what they want? This is an obstacle for the Pharisees like no other. I believe they would have believed in Jesus. They would have followed him had he simply fulfilled the requirements of the law, done what Isaiah did, Jeremiah did, and some of the others, made a prediction, had it fulfilled, right there in their presence, maybe a week out, maybe a few days out, maybe a month out, and probably the whole nation would have followed him. The question is this: why didn't he want them to know? Why didn't he want to give them certainty as to his identity? Why? And that question continues to be powerful because it's still relevant today. The experience of the Pharisees continues to be the experience of Christians and non-Christians alike, that it seems as though God gives us enough evidence to believe, but not enough to be certain. The church has spent a lot of time dealing with this and a lot of time trying to build up certainty so that we can be absolutely convinced that Jesus was who he said he was. There are books and books written providing evidences and proofs. And we're made to believe when we read those books that the evidence is so overwhelming that only a hardened sinner filled with the spirit of Satan himself could possibly deny the evidence at hand. But that is not the experience of the apostles in Mark. Jesus is cagey, cryptic. He conceals his message and his identity. When he does miracles, he tells people not to say anything about it. When he interacts with demons, he quiets them. When he's asked for a sign, he refuses it. And he behaves in ways that the Messiah was not expected to behave. What's with the secret? What's with the hiddenness? Why do it that way? And why continue to do it that way to this day? There are people who are broken on the altar of evidence to this day. And the amazing thing for me in Mark is that that's the struggle of the Pharisees. And in many ways, the struggle of the apostles. In Isaiah, when Isaiah has that vision of being swept up into the throne room of God, and when he gets there and he sees this scene and God says, "Who can I send?" And Isaiah says, "Send me." And God, you think, what a moment this is, right? And then God says to him, "Okay, let me tell you." God doesn't tell you, at least not Isaiah, what he wanted him to do until after Isaiah agreed to do it, right? And Isaiah agreed, and God says, "This is what I want you to do. I want you to go and speak in such a way that nobody will understand anything you say. I want you to go and speak in such a way that you will harden the hearts of your people, and they will not be able to comprehend it, and they will continue in their sin, and then I'm going to destroy them." And Isaiah says, "I'm unworthy of that task." That's his response, right? Then he gets the coal and all that stuff. Now, why would you send someone to do that? Jesus quotes that passage to explain to his disciples why he speaks in parables. And again here in this passage, he refuses to let the Pharisees have the evidence they would need to believe in him. Now, there's a simple theological solution that some posit for this problem. And it's simply that Jesus had to die. And so he obscured the eyes of people so that they would kill him, so that he could die for their sins. And then after he rose from the dead, the veil would be ripped, and the veil pulled up from over their eyes, and they would recognize who he was. But that's not really persuasive to me. And the reason it's not persuasive is because God still continues to refuse to bow to human demands that he demonstrate who he is in the way we want him to demonstrate it. Why is that? I think one of the reasons that Jesus constantly refuses to be that responsive to human demand is that if he were to respond to human demand in that way, then in the end, he would be subordinated to us. Jesus is trying to reveal the fact he is God. And God reveals himself by laying down his life for his enemies. God reveals himself by loving those who persecute him. God reveals himself by taking on the form of a servant when he had the rights to take on the form of a king. But one thing that God will not do is reveal himself as not God. He will not reveal himself as not God. And this ties us back to the law of Moses. The law of Moses was intended to be a human document to evaluate human claims. So if a prophet who was human came, he had to demonstrate the proof of his prophetic office by doing signs and miracles. But God did not write the law as a law over God. And Jesus refuses to be judged by the law of Moses. Now, he lives faithful to it because the law of Moses reveals Jesus' character. God's character is revealed in the law of Moses. Jesus faithfully lives that out. But what Jesus will not do is submit himself to that law because he's the God of that law. And this is such an important point for us to grasp because we too are at risk for the same thing the Pharisees were at risk of, which is worshiping the Word instead of the God who spoke it. Jesus is God of the law. He would not allow the law to judge him. That is essentially important, and I think for Mark, that is critically important. Whatever Jesus is going to do, he is not going to do one of two things. He's not going to let the law be the determiner of his identity, because he's the author of it. And secondly, he is not going to bow to human demand and subordinate himself as God of the universe to human will or power. And so we see consistently in Mark Jesus refusing to reveal himself in ways that would deny his true identity. The yeast of the Pharisees that Jesus is warning against, and the yeast of Herod is this: the belief that a human has authority over God. Herod thought that he could decide whether Jesus was who he claimed to be or not. He thought he had that authority. Remember, Jesus was brought before him? The Pharisees thought that they had the right and responsibility to determine who Jesus was and what he was allowed to do or not allowed to do. Jesus refused to play their game. If he had done what they asked, he would have been submitting to their authority to ask the question. And he did not accept it, and so he refused. When we put God to the test and say, if you are God, then I'm going to give you the hoops you have to jump through to prove that you are, and once you've proven it to me, then I will submit myself to you. In the end, what that is doing is the human is playing God and making God play the role of the created being who bows to the will of the created one, the Creator. And only once he's submitted to us will we submit to him. And God doesn't play that game. If we are to come to God, the proper posture is to recognize him as God as we come. When we make demands on him, then we recognize him as our servant, not as our God. This is the point of salvation. He didn't go to the cross because humans demanded it. He went to the cross of his own will, and that demonstrates his love. Not that we ever deserved it. Matter of fact, one way you could read the entire history of humanity from Genesis on is that really we all deserve to die in the flood. The fact that any of us survived that is only by the mercy of God. Even the book of Genesis says after Noah survived the flood, and we think, well, Noah was a righteous man. Maybe there's some kind of righteous DNA in him that God's preserved. But at the end of that, God says in Genesis chapter 8, after the whole world's been wiped out and he's preserved Noah and his family, that still every inclination of the human heart is only evil from childhood. The flood did not accomplish the destruction of evil. And so humans as wicked after the flood as they were before. Why did he save us? It's a surprise that any of us have survived. It's such a surprise that we cannot describe the cross as anything other than the graciousness of God that has nothing whatsoever to do with the goodness of humanity. If we think of it as any other thing, that humans were created by God so he loves them like children and that's why he died, all those explanations raise us to the level of the worthiness of his death. But the point of Scripture, and he says this with Jacob, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Not that Jacob had done anything good or bad, but simply for God's purpose and election. Powerful passage in Romans 9. But the point again is that humanity does not deserve the love that God has lavished on it. He's done it of his own free will. And he's asked us to come to a God who would do that for us. But when humans make demands on him and say, I'll come if, I'll come if, I'll come if, and we make our bargains, what we do is we try to make God play the servant to our godliness. And Jesus doesn't play that game. He doesn't play it in the Gospels. He's unresponsive to those demands because it would set the wrong standard. One thing Jesus is, for good or for bad, is he is consistent in his declaration of who he is. And he will not let his behavior, he will not let his circumstances, he will not let his words ever betray the truth. He will always be faithful to the truth of who he is. And if he were to answer that prayer of demand that we make on him, he would be false to who he is. And I think that's at stake here with these Pharisees. And they're frustrated because they feel like because they have the law of Moses, they have the right to ask the questions they're asking of him. But Jesus continues to say, you have the right to ask those questions of others. He even invites the church to ask those questions of other church folk. He says, test the spirits to see if they're from God. That's right out of Sinai. He forces us to evaluate other humans the same way the Pharisees were evaluating him. But the difference was, we are not God. We must be evaluated. We cannot be trusted. But Jesus does not invite us to evaluate him. He invites us to come. And so the good news of the gospel is not that God has made us worthy, but that God was willing to die for us despite our unworthiness. That's a challenge for us. And it was a stumbling block for the Pharisees, because if he would have submitted to them, they would have followed. And how many of us, and how many of our friends, and how many of our neighbors is that true of? If God would join us where we are, if he would submit to our authority, if he would take on our values and our beliefs, we would follow. Of course we would, because it would make us God. And in the truth, it wouldn't be us following God, it would be God following us. And in the end, that insidious type of self-centeredness may lie at the root of the greatest obstacle any of us will ever face in following the God of creation. And it's this: he refuses in any of our lives to be anything other than God. Any demand we make of him to make himself less than God for our sake will always fall flat. And so we sit in the dark crying for him to submit to our wills. And he refuses. Just as he refused to give the sign to the Pharisees that would have saved them, but it wouldn't have saved them, because they would have come to him, but not to him. They would have brought God to them and not themselves to God. It's a tricky little hair to split, but it's one that the Pharisees stumbled over, and in the end they stumbled over Jesus' refusal to submit to them. And not over his miracles, not over his claims, not even over his authority. I'm sure much of what he said rang true, but the one thing they could not overcome was his refusal to submit to their authority. And in the end, that's the obstacle that led them to kill him. And I fear it's the obstacle that will lead many today to sacrifice him again.